Said 10. And we are live.
All right. Good morning again to everyone, Madam Speaker, members of the work group. It is a pleasure to be here with you again today. Before I get into just a couple points to make, I want to welcome two new members of the COVID work group. In the Senate, we have a new minority leader and minority whip. And so joining us today for the first time are Senator Simon Ayer, our new minority leader, and Senator Huff, the new minority whip. And so welcome them to this work that has been ongoing in the midst of this pandemic. It has been roughly a month since we've last met, and certainly a lot, as has been the case throughout this, has continued to transpire. One of the headline issues that I know that the Speaker and I have spoken a great deal about, and members throughout the General Assembly, is the opening, the reopening, the closing, the reclosing of Maryland's public schools. This has been incredibly challenging on every front, and we've seen efforts in every county to try to do what I think all of us would agree is the best thing to safely reopen schools as quickly as can be done in a safe fashion. Unfortunately, we've seen the spike of the virus in several places, and schools have had to since shut down, which is evidence of the ongoing dynamic nature of this experience. And so what we know we are going to need is leadership from the state and from the Department of Education to give clear guidance, clear metrics, and clear instructions moving forward so that we can get kids back in school safely, and so that educators and school communities feel as safe as possible in an inherently risky time. The second thing are brief remarks about the governor's $250 million request to use the state's rainy day fund to support small businesses through the COVID-19 crisis. There's no doubt that we've seen unbelievable challenges from the small businesses across the state of Maryland. And so many are struggling day in and day out to just make it to the next week. We will be having a meeting of the Legislative Policy Committee later today to discuss this use of the rainy day funds. It is very likely that small businesses are an absolutely essential place where we need to support, but as policymakers that oversee issues across that run the gambit in the state of Maryland, we need to make sure that the dollars are being used as efficiently and effectively as possible for the highest and most critical priorities. Third, we have started to see cases rise across the state. And I think it's only fair to say that it is starting to get to a place where we may need to bear down again. And that doesn't mean closure, but it means be prepared, be mindful, and be safe. We are going to have to be ever more vigilant. The good news is that I think the state of Maryland is better positioned than almost any other state in the country with the work that we've done to make sure that proper precautions are being taken up voluntarily in some cases and mandated in many others. We've not seen the virus rise as much as our surrounding areas, but we are going to have to maintain the level of vigilance because unfortunately, if we look at the states around us, the trends are not promising. And so here in Maryland, we're going to have a duty to each other to see that we manage through this as well as possible. Finally, today, we are very pleased to have some great individuals speaking with us today about the distribution, the progress, the planning, and the coordination of the distribution of what will be an eventual vaccine. Maryland is the home to some incredible researchers and medical establishments that have been leading the charge here, and we'll hear from a number of them today. The agenda is pretty packed today, members, so we will be trying to move things along as expeditiously as possible. We've built in some time for questions, but it is a rather packed agenda with a lot of rich, deep information, hearing from a number of partners. With that, Madam Speaker, I hand it over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Get right into it. Roughly 40% of Americans are skeptical about a vaccine for COVID-19. This is both understandable and alarming. Today's work group is focused on learning more about the development and distribution of a vaccine here in Maryland. It's our job to cut through the rhetoric and provide the public with facts. The Senate President and I have brought together some of the country's leading experts on vaccines, as well as our own health department's officials today, and we look forward to hearing from them. As was mentioned by the Senate President, the agenda is packed with important information, so let's be brief in our comments and concise in our questions. Our first panel is from the University of Maryland Medical System, and I'll turn it over to Christian Bryce from that system for introduction. Christian?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not sure, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Good morning, President Ferguson, Speaker Jones, and the members of the Legislative COVID Response Workgroup. I hear your message, Speaker Jones. I understand that the agenda is pretty packed, so I'm going to be super brief and just let everybody know that I'm here today with two incredible faculty members from the University of Maryland School of Medicine to share with you some of their expertise on vaccine development, safety, efficacy, and distribution. Dr. Wilbur Chen is an infectious disease expert with the School of Medicine, and he will talk to you a little bit about not only his credentials, but some of the positions he's been tapped to serve in as a result of this global pandemic. In addition to Dr. Chen, Dr. David Markozzi, who is an emergency room physician by training, is with us. Dr. Markozzi is also the leader of our population health within the Department of Emergency Medicine at the School of Medicine, and he leads our incident command. So from the inception of this global pandemic, he has coordinated our collective response, both the University of Maryland Medical System and the University of Maryland at Baltimore, our collective response to the global pandemic. So if you don't mind, I know our agenda is a little bit flipped, but I would like to start with Dr. Chen, who I know has another obligation that he has to get to shortly. Thank you.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. This is Wilbur Chen. Do you have my slides?
Well, my apologies, Dr. Chen and whoever's running the slides. I think we have the order flipped. So.
That is, I think, my first slide. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Good morning, everyone, and thank you for listening to me today. I've spent my career doing vaccine development. So what I'm trying to do is give you perspective and context as we move forward into this pandemic and talk about vaccine implementation. Next slide. So this is kind of my worldview of developing vaccines, and it starts from the discovery phase, and it goes through preclinical and then clinical development, where you have phase 1, 2, 3 trials. Then you have a regulatory approval, which is licensure. Then you continue to work on policy and financing levels normally, and then you launch into delivering the vaccine, and you hopefully monitor the impact, and you have post-licensure studies. Again, this is a very truncated schedule in the context of COVID-19, but this is to give you context that normally this is an undertaking that takes about a decade. Next slide. So I think what's most important to give you context is to talk about the different vaccine platforms. So again, we don't have licensed vaccines, but we have what we call platforms, which are technologies that allow us to make vaccines for any type of new pathogen that we might be able to identify. Now, on the top of the slide, you see this circle, which is the virus itself, studded by these proteins on the surface, which are the spike protein. And that's really the primary part of the virus that we try to make vaccines to fight against COVID. Now, in this slide, you're seeing the traditional approach for making vaccines, which for decades we've been using chickens' eggs to make vaccines, many various vaccines. We have some newer approaches which have only been coming online for the past decade or so, which are live attenuated vaccines. That's like the MedImmune vaccine, which is a nasal influenza vaccine. It also includes something like measles vaccine, which is also a live vaccine, yellow fever vaccine. There are other vaccines. Recombinant vaccines, that's like the hepatitis B vaccine. This is where you take a bacteria and make it express that protein of interest. You have cell culture based, which is basically like, you can think of it like brewing beer. So you have a large vat in which you have a fermenter, and you make your vaccine in that fashion as well. So it's a very purified way of making a vaccine in a facility. And then you can add adjuvants, which says right there, POW, and that's because what it does is it is able to enhance a vaccine and make you have a better response. And so that's something like the shingles vaccine, which you might have heard about, which is an adjuvanted vaccine, which really has tremendous results among older adults that are receiving that vaccine for shingles. Then we have future vaccines, and there are no vaccines that are licensed using these platforms, but these are the vaccines that are being developed currently that you can hear about, and I'll show that in the next slide, for COVID-19. And that might be the DNA or RNA-based vaccines. It'll be virus vectored vaccines, and I'll talk about a couple of those, and virus-like particles and virosomes as well. So these are all future approaches. A lot of these are being used for some of the vaccines that are being developed. But again, this provides you context when we talk about these different COVID vaccines so that you understand why we're saying, oh, these vaccines have never really been created before. Next slide. Okay, so these are the leading US vaccines. So Pfizer has a vaccine in red font is really the kind of the formal name for them. I don't think that we need to be stuck on those. What I wanted you to look at was that there are right now 5 different major companies that are coming, that are online right now conducting phase 3 clinical studies. These are in parentheses showing you the technologies that I just reviewed with you. So mRNA-based approaches are being used by the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. Viral vectored vaccines are being used by that Astrazeneca and J&J vaccine. And I think that you have a J&J representative that will talk more specifically about that. But these are where you take other viruses. In this case, it's an adeno 26 for the Johnson & Johnson and a chimpanzee adenovirus. And you basically have it express the spike protein of COVID. Okay, so you're taking advantage of that known virus that is not really pathogenic in humans, and you basically make it express that protein of interest. And then you have the Novavax vaccine, which is a nanoparticle that's adjuvanted, again, giving you that better enhanced immune response. In gray font, you can see there, it's grayed out because they haven't started phase 3 studies, but there's a company called Inovio, and there's another company called Sanofi Pasteur that has partnered up with GSK, and they have vaccines as well that they will be bringing online very soon into clinical studies. Again, the context is globally, worldwide, there are 180 different vaccines in development, various levels. Some of them are in discovery phase, not even entered into phase 1, okay? But these are the leading candidates here. Next slide. So what can I say? So, just to give you a wide overview of the licensure pathway. So when we talk about the phase 1, the phase 2, phase 3 studies, these are the human studies. The phase 1 is the initial study. Usually it's just looking purely at the safety of those vaccines because that's really the first time that it's being introduced and tested in humans. The number of people is usually on the order of 100 or so. Then you go to a phase 2 study, which you start kind of expanding out the numbers, and that's where it's hundreds to thousands of people that'll be participating in those studies. And that's where you continue to collect safety information, but then you start really understanding the immune response to the vaccine much, much better. Then we go to the phase 3, and that's where, again, we have only a handful, 5 right now that are in the US that are in phase 3. And that's where we start to look at efficacy. So the immune response that we look at is really only to help us to understand, can we predict whether or not it'll be protective? But the only way to really look at protection is in these phase 3 studies. And that's where you have tens of thousands of people that will be participating in these studies. Now, the US FDA provided guidance for industry, and they published the draft guidance in June and then finalized this draft guidance in September. But basically, this really gives the guideposts for how COVID vaccines will be licensed in the US. And so if you look at that, it really talks about that the evidence for efficacy, safety, and immune response has to be generalizable. It has to be inclusive of all segments of the population, high-risk parts of the population, and also among communities of color, which again have disproportionately felt the effects and the burdens of COVID-19 disease. We also want to look at the efficacy, the FDA does, And they want to be sure that this vaccine can protect against symptomatic lab-confirmed infection. Now notice that it does not say specifically that it has to prevent hospitalizations and deaths, but that's implicit within that. So the primary outcome measure, that means the first thing that they're really looking at is preventing symptomatic infections. But in the context of all of these studies, they are looking at prevention of hospitalizations and deaths. So I just wanted to re-encourage you of that as well. So, you know, there are other markers of what a vaccine can be efficacious for, and to make a public health argument for its value. So in other words, a vaccine can be valuable if it prevents deaths, it prevents hospitalizations, it prevents infections, but also we can look at whether it prevents respiratory failure, kidney failure, or some other markers as well. That's part of the value of the vaccine. And the statistics, you know, in this document, it says that it has to have at least 50% efficacy. Now you might say 50%, that's not good enough. But if 50% efficacy against preventing symptomatic infection is what we're looking at, but also it prevents 90% hospitalizations, that's a very valuable vaccine. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that you understood the context of the whole discussion under efficacy when the FDA licenses vaccines. Next slide. All right, so what can and can't be evaluated in these phase 3 studies? Well, in terms of safety, through all these studies, we're looking at specifically what we can see. So injection site reactions, we can see systemic reactions as well, like fever, malaise, you know, pain. We can look really at those common adverse effects, because we're only going to be able to evaluate tens of thousands of people. Are we going to be able to see rare but serious adverse effects? Well, if it's rare to the extent that it only happens 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million, then no, we will not. But hopefully that will not be true for these vaccines. And again, in general, for all of the licensed vaccines that we have, it's so incredibly uncommon to see rare but serious adverse effects that will actually be detrimental to implementing a vaccine. Okay, now efficacy. As I said already, we are trying to prevent symptomatic illness with these studies. It's not designed to assess whether or not it has any effect on asymptomatic infections. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We may be able to make some statements about if it affects medical complications like heart attacks, strokes, kidney disease, respiratory failure. And again, we might be able to look at hospitalizations and deaths. Again, that's not the formal primary outcome measure, but we will hopefully be able to make some statements around those topics as well, again, to tell you about the value of these vaccines. Next slide. All right, so I sit on the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is actually meeting right now, so that's why I need to hurry up and join that meeting, and it's for the next 3 days. On Friday, the whole day is discussing COVID vaccines. Now, part of that is that we've been trying to be prepared to have policy prepared for the implementation of vaccines nationally. And we have to recognize that there will probably be limited supplies initially when any of these vaccines are licensed. And hopefully all 5 of them will be licensed and approved. But if, again, we don't know which of these vaccines will actually come across the finish line in the end. Now, because there will be limited supplies, we have to make sure that we prioritize or tier or in some way maximize the utility of these vaccines. And that means that we have to recognize the highest risk parts of the population, either risk of acquiring the infection or risk of having severe infections. We are trying to think of an equitable and ethical framework for this policy. These national guidelines also have to be flexible enough, because we have to allow for local jurisdictional implementation. So that means that states like our state of Maryland, again, we have rural areas and we have urban areas. Again, we have to have local jurisdictional flexibility within the national guidelines that we develop. We also have to understand the logistics of these vaccines. That yellow balloon out is actually supposed to be, I don't know why it got moved, but it's basically talking about each of these different vaccines even just recognizing part of the logistics implications is that they have storage conditions that are different. The Pfizer vaccine requires an extremely cold storage condition of -70 degrees Celsius. Moderna is -20. The others are just refrigeration temperature, 4 degrees Celsius. But each of these vaccines, again, requires different logistics implications for how you are able to allocate, temporarily store them on site and distribute them forward in the field. And then, of course, part of policy is having a message for public health value, which again, we would hope is a coordinated effort throughout the state, where MDH is also coordinating this effort, but also that local doctors are also using the same messages. But we also hope that nationally as well, that we are using the same messaging as well. Because again, as Madam Speaker said, there are a lot of people that would not receive vaccine at this moment if it were currently licensed. So we have a lot of work to do. So in blue, I'm saying that we need to maximize benefits, minimize harms, have equity, justice, transparency. We have to be evidence-based in our approach and be feasible in implementation. Next slide. So as part of this, we recognize that there are many population risk groups. And so I've just bulleted out some of those. And nationally, you can see how we enumerated those. The total US population is 330 million approximately. And so next slide, if you push again, it shows you some Venn diagrams that are overlapping that shows you some of these populations, and some of them overlap. So should you be a healthcare worker that happens to be 75 years of age, but also have a prior heart attack, you are in that Venn diagram where you are in overlapping circles. So again, you might be at the highest risk of acquiring the infection and also highest risk of severity of infection. Next slide. So I'll end there. This is again to show you that vaccine development is usually a long way to go. We are accelerating through this, and we are right now only 10 months into this pandemic. And we're already talking about phase 3 studies, and we're already talking about trying to think about delivery so that we can make an impact. Next slide. So thank you very much. I just want to remind all of you to get your flu shot, keep all of your vaccinations up to date, maintain a healthy diet, keep exercise. And what this pyramid is showing you, this upside down pyramid, is really what I'm talking about for risk mitigation and control, these non-pharmacologic interventions, teleworking like we're doing right now, physical distancing, PPE, universal masking, all of these are very important. And I'm so proud that Maryland has been a leader in all of this nationally. So I want to thank you very much, and I'll hand it off to David Markozzi.
Good morning. If you could just come back on the slides. Can you hear me fine? Great, terrific. Thanks, everybody. President Ferguson, let me make sure my slides are teed up. Let me hit the... Terrific, thanks. President Ferguson, Speaker Jones, esteemed colleagues, good morning. I'm pleased to be here today with my UMB colleague, Dr. Wilbur Chen, to talk about our preparation and response to the impending approval of the COVID-19 vaccine. Important to note that I think that my remarks will be jumping from Dr. Chen's and building out some of those other greater specifics around vaccine distribution. My name is David Markozzi. I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and lead for the COVID-19 Unified Command across our University of Maryland Medical System and UMB. I also serve on Governor Hogan's Maryland Coronavirus Response and Recovery Task Force with Dr. Chen. Next slide. Since the inception of this crisis, our medical system and the University of Maryland, Baltimore have been working in coordination to achieve optimal healthcare delivery and advance the science so we can better understand and respond to the SARS-CoV-2 threat. Our system-based approach, adopted under the Unified Command structure, assured the right care was delivered at the right time for all our patients while protecting our workforce. Next slide. There are ongoing considerations that we need to continue to address. Without question, we are entering a high-risk period this winter, and response fatigue is real. We need to understand that our decisions impact each other. In this pandemic, we are our brother's keeper. I encourage us all to double our individual and collective efforts over the next 12 weeks so we can get to the other side of this crisis as healthy as possible. I'll now take a moment to describe our work related to potential COVID-19 vaccine distribution and administration, which is critical to this response. Next slide. Under the unified command, we have stood up a vaccine work group, a multidisciplinary team, including doctors, nurses, public health and logistics experts, legal and communications professionals, working with our federal and Maryland Department of Health partners, focusing on making COVID-19 vaccination in Maryland a success. Our energy is devoted to advancing the health of our communities by developing distribution and administration plans and addressing the current perception of the vaccine and what we know it will take to ensure that Maryland's vaccination rate is high. We're all aware of the concerns regarding vaccine safety, the efficacy of a vaccine, even once FDA has approved, as Dr. Chen mentioned, and the questions about manufacturing and issues with regard to distribution. Next slide. The challenges are great. One example of this is a recent study describing steps to build public trust if we are to be successful. Right now, Marylanders are not confident about the COVID-19 vaccine. Since it has not been approved, we do have time, but not much. We need to move quickly to build confidence, knowledge, and understanding so that our efforts will be successful in a safe and effective vaccine administration. Next slide. The vaccine work group is addressing the following priority areas: workforce and patients prioritization, population health efforts, information technology, logistics and supply chain, and finally, public health education and communications. Next slide. At the foundation and used by our MDH partners in our state plan, our work group has adopted the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's framework for the equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine. This framework recognizes that race and ethnicity and health equity are intertwined with the impact of COVID-19, and there are certain populations that are at increased risk of severe illness or death from COVID-19. Across our nation and worldwide, the COVID-19 pandemic has shed light on the pervasive impacts of social and structural inequalities in society. COVID-19 is having a disproportionate impact on people who are already disadvantaged by virtue of their race or ethnicity, age, health, or other contributing factors. This framework, we feel, allows us to equitably distribute the vaccine while providing a high level of transparency to the process. Next slide. Seen here, pardon me, yes, great. Seen here, the four phases of our framework recognize that we are all in this pandemic together, and it recommends an approach that not only addresses the fundamental issues related to population-based morbidity and mortality risks, but also further addresses the disparity associated with this disease. Next slide. One key tenet is the healthcare response to this pandemic and our ability to protect and vaccinate our healthcare workers. It will be important to prioritize our workforce based on the National Academy's work. Their recommendations, recognizing that many of our workforce will have the same perceptions, health limitations, and reservations as the general public, are something that we need to understand and be transparent about. The distribution framework for local facilities currently across the University of Maryland system is ongoing. Communication strategies, we feel, must address a negative workforce potential perception of early vaccination adoption. And lastly, each of our facilities must have local operational plans for vaccination administration to our workforce, which we are presently adopting. Next slide. We realize that our hospitals are anchor institutions within communities across Maryland, relied on for acute care, but also providing optimal preventative care to avoid illness. To that end, and in coordination with the Maryland Department of Health COVID-19 vaccination plan, it is critically important to develop population-based vaccination distribution and administration plans. This will include vaccination of inpatients, outpatients, and the larger communities of which we serve. Next slide. Essential to a successful vaccination campaign in our state is the need to register or to become COVID-19 vaccination providers, order vaccines, track delivery, report doses administered, and notify individuals when second doses are due. This can all be accomplished through a robust information technology platform, which can assist us with understanding any constraints and keep real-time monitoring of efforts. Like many adjustments we've had to make during these trying times, the integration of our employee records management system and electronic health records with the state information technology tracking system is necessary for successful vaccination distribution administration. We also recognize the need to follow vaccinations through this IT platform in different environments. For instance, the inpatient sector, outpatient sector, and our communities. Next slide. Like other hospital systems throughout the country during the spring and winter, our supply chain was strained. To address this, we have established strategic warehousing and logistics capacity. Additionally, we are working to understand the logistical requirements for mass vaccination and realize that secure and safe storage and efficient distribution of vaccine are critical to successful vaccine administration. In preparation for vaccine distribution, we have continued to adjust the evolving cold chain logistical requirements and how we would protect and distribute that vaccine in accordance with those requirements. Additionally, we have begun purchasing additional supplies and ancillary PPE for both internal and external vaccination sites. Next slide. So while we are diligently working to put programs and processes in place to provide the vaccine to as many people as possible, we pride ourselves on the clinical and operational expertise to do so. But we are also mindful, as we would remind us all, that vaccines do not save lives. Vaccinations do. To that end, we need to understand the public's reservation and understanding of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development and distribution plan, who is making them, who is delivering them, and how they will need to keep themselves healthy and safe from this life-threatening and debilitating disease. Establishing trust in a safe and effective vaccine is a fundamental factor to whether our vaccine campaign here in Maryland, or anywhere in the country for that matter, will be successful. Effective and well-informed communications will be key to helping both our public and our healthcare workforce across Maryland understand and feel confident in the COVID-19 vaccine. So how do we build trust and leverage what we have learned to help our communities feel more knowledgeable, empowered, and confident in getting the COVID-19 vaccine? We have our work cut out for us to be successful. It will take all of us, legislators, the executive side of government, all our state Maryland Department of Health colleagues, and healthcare delivery experts and public health colleagues to build a campaign long before this vaccine is ready to distribute. It needs to start now. Our COVID-19 vaccination preparation work group will be adopting public health strategies and communication efforts, including we'll be surveying communities statewide to learn about their knowledge, attitude, and behaviors regarding the COVID-19 response. This actually was already fielded on October 22nd, and results are due November 12th. We'll then conduct qualitative research to learn why our community members feel they do about vaccine, to better understand what they told us in the survey and how we can understand communication strategies to address some of their concerns. From this, we'll share our results with all colleagues across the state and our state partners to assure that we're developing a coordinated public health education campaign utilizing a wide variety of platforms to disseminate factual information based on science for all stakeholder groups. We will also survey our healthcare providers to learn their knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors with regard to vaccines, from what they know presently, from what we should message, so that they can best address interactions with patients. Next slide. In summary, the University of Maryland Medical System and the University of Maryland Baltimore Unified Command is continually working to prepare and respond to any challenges we might face in this pandemic, particularly the one on the next horizon, vaccination. We stand ready with our state, community partners, and healthcare leaders across the state to develop and deliver an effective program that will instill trust and confidence in the vaccination. And we will continue to contribute to the advancing public health communication strategy and public health condition for Maryland, so we can move towards a successful vaccination campaign across our state during these unprecedented times. Mr. President, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It looks like we have one question, Senator Roosevelt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, professors, for your presentations. I got two, I think, pretty brief questions. One is, do I understand that this UMS presentation really is just about UMS? All the things you raised are about how you guys are going to do it, not really. They're relevant to everything else, but the plan you're talking about is like your internal plan. Do I understand it correctly?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I'll comment on that. So our work, you're correct. We were asked to speak around the UMB strategy around vaccination, but I'll also let you know we are already linked with the Maryland Department of Health on multiple different aspects, including being part of their technical advisory group presently. So it is a coordinated strategy of which we're describing.
Great. So then my second question is, who decides and how is it decided how vaccines get distributed? Because we had in the spring and the summer, and now basically we have a free market in PPE, in tests, and everything. And that was a decision made at the federal level, I guess, and at the state level. Is your expectation that's what will happen with vaccines or not?
Maybe I can take this question. We hope that there will be a national level coordination, but as I say, there will also be within that national level coordination flexibility such that when these vaccines are handed down, that at the state level, there will be jurisdictional value from the state getting involved. And I think MDH will be talking to this later on today to speak more specifically about what their expectations are. But right now, we do not exactly know what the national level coordination will look like. And so I think the state is scrambling from MDH level to try to understand and coordinate a response. And then I think, again, the local jurisdictional level for University of Maryland Medical Systems is that we are also trying to, again, stay ahead of this by also having a very high level of preparedness should we be called, and we expect to be called upon as critical partners for the state to implement these vaccines. So I think, again, we are trying to have a coordinated effort, but again, there is a lack of clarity as to the higher levels of the response. Hopefully I answered that question for you.
Sort of, I mean, no kidding, there's lack of clarity at the higher levels. I guess my question is, from an UMS point of view, are you preparing for an allocation system with a government monopoly, and also in parallel preparing for having to go in the open market to get them?
I can try to answer that again. We think that these vaccines will be allocated to us and it will not be an open market, that there will be an equitable national level where the CDC will again be looking at distributing to the state level, but they will not be, I don't think, providing additional instructions for each particular state to how to distribute. They may provide general guidelines, but they will, I don't think, provide very, very detailed level state level, because I think that, again, there are 50 different states with 50 different circumstances. So I think that that is what I'm anticipating from the national level.
Just one comment. I would
Senator, we're running out of time.
Hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
We have about 2 minutes, and actually, if we could just have Senator Chair of our Finance Committee, Kelly, ask a brief question, then have Senator Lamb ask the question, and then get the response to both, so that we can condense them. Senator
Thank
Kelly.
you. I'd be interested in knowing if you're considering training area pharmacists who now are becoming more familiar with the public, and the public trusting them to do annual influenza and other kinds of shingles, vaccinations, and so on, if they could have the correct capacity for cold storage. And also, do you anticipate that if one of the preparation platforms requires a repeated annual vaccination and another does not, that we'll need so much capacity that maybe both types would be on the market simultaneously? Thank you.
And Senator Lamb?
Yeah, so a follow-up question on the cold storage. I noticed that the state's plan does not recommend that people purchase cold storage, or the facilities purchase cold storage equipment. In your expertise, is there a way to be able to distribute this without cold storage, maybe through dry ice and whatnot? Maybe it's distributed fast enough. And if you can't answer that question, maybe MDH afterwards can as well. And then the other piece of it too is just to make sure that people in the public have a right sense of expectation of what the vaccine means, that we will still be, in all likelihood, have to live with the effects of COVID for still quite some time, even after the vaccine comes, because the vaccine may not be 100% effective, right? And I think it's important for the public to balance their expectations that we still could be living with this through 2021 and maybe even into 2022, to understand that, through follow-up tests and vaccinations and maybe even new vaccines that might come out.
So it sounds like we have pharmacies, multiple vaccines, the length of time, and cold storage. Does anyone, do you want to split, Dr. Chen, or any one of those four?
Okay, let's see. So pharmacists, that is something that I think many groups are trying to look forward to. We just don't know if the distribution of these vaccines will be wide scale enough that we can actually distribute it to that level to the local pharmacy. It might be, again, as I said, with the limited allocation of doses, initially at least, that there will only be centralized distribution sites, such that maybe in the state of Maryland, it might only be at the level for the county health department and single distribution sites. Again, because of limitations in the number of doses that will be available initially. And then as it gets moved out, then hopefully we'll be able to push it out to other partners such as pharmacists who are in local communities to make it much easier to be able to deliver and implement these vaccines. And I think that that is the idea. Again, coordination is something that our medical system can do only to a certain extent, but we want to be prepared to help MDH to be able to do those efforts. So I think the answer is, yes, we are thinking about it, but we don't have the authority to do that at the state level. And again, we want to be critical partners, so we're prepared to be able to step into that if we need to. As far as the cold storage requirements and the requirement for, again, whether or not there will be an annual dosage, we don't know that. I guess we'll just only be able to approach that when we know it comes. But let's just get to the first gate, which is, again, trying to just deliver these vaccines, the first 1 or 2 doses, to the general population as best as possible. The logistics requirements are quite tremendous. Yes, we can try to use dry ice. We can try to use liquid nitrogen or other measures to be able to achieve that cold temperature requirement. Again, I'm expecting that there's already a national run on refrigeration units of all sorts. There may be a national run on dry ice and liquid nitrogen and other ways to maintain cold temperature. So again, I'm hoping that there will be somewhat of a coordinated effort. I really don't want this to be that free market environment where every state had to defend for itself. I think the governor has led the way in which he's led multiple state coalitions to be able to acquire certain supplies and materials. So if it ever came to that, hopefully we would be able to have a coalition where we would have that market power. But I don't want that to happen, and I don't think that we want that. And I think people at higher levels are probably trying to plan as best as possible to avoid that situation.
Excellent. Dr. Markozzi, any final thoughts? Do we still have Dr. Markozzi?
No, yeah, I'm on. I appreciate it. I was just I was muted. No, I think that first of all, we've already started planning for a lot of the things Dr. Chen mentioned with regard to cold chain stores, the communication strategies. We've actually already purchased 4 super cold chain storage capabilities for the University of Maryland medical system. We look forward to working with our partners. Stay healthy, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you both. This was incredibly detail-rich information, and very thankful for your leadership on this, and that we're so lucky in Maryland to have your expertise. Next up, we have a panel from the pharmaceutical industry who has been leading the way on these vaccines. We have Phyllis Arthur, the Vice President of Infectious Diseases and Diagnostic Policy for Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Dr. Rick Nettles, the Vice President of Medical Affairs for Janssen Pharmaceutica, which is owned by Johnson & Johnson, and Christine Bloomquist, who is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs for AstraZeneca. Members, we will do about 5 minutes apiece. We'll have each individual panelist present, and then we'll do a section for question and answers of the entire panel at the end. So let's begin with Phyllis Arthur.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, President Ferguson and Speaker Jones, for inviting me today. I'm actually going to hop around my slides because some of the things I have in there, Dr. Chen covered quite wonderfully. So I'll try to drill down on a few issues that were raised by the questions and what he presented. Next slide, please. Go ahead. So actually, this just captures in a picture what Dr. Chen showed, which is the vaccines that are in late stage development. I wanted to highlight in particular the slides with the little American flags that are in red are the ones that are being supported at the federal level by Operation Warp Speed, and just answer a question that was raised. The contracts done by the US government with these manufacturers actually include help on R&D development, manufacturing, but also procurement. So very similar to the way we saw with H1N1 during the pandemic flu in 2009, it's our expectation that the US government will indeed be procuring these doses in the hundreds of millions from the various companies if they are successful, of course, with clinical trials and FDA approvals. And the vaccine itself would be distributed through the CDC process, more souped up than what we saw during H1N1 because it's much more doses and many more people, but following that same idea of pandemic response where the process would include free vaccine purchased through the federal government. So just, I know that was a question asked. In the beginning, that is in this pandemic period while we're responding to the emergency, we would anticipate the vaccines would be free and offered by the federal government. Later on, when we're out of the emergency, what happens with these vaccines will probably look more like the public-private sector for vaccines today. Next question. Next slide, please. Sorry. So this is a slide actually from Operation Warp Speed, and you can find this on the Department of Defense site. I use it because I think it mirrors something that Dr. Chen covered quite nicely, which is how are we going faster and where are we not going faster? And I think that's one of the key questions people have is, how can we go so fast when it takes 10 years to make a vaccine? Why are we going so quickly? He highlighted a few things. One, the new platforms that he highlighted and described so well actually are allowing us to get from preclinical vaccine to something actually ready for human trials much, much faster. They actually don't use the virus itself. They use the genetic data, the genetic sequencing data for the vaccine. Where we are continuing to spend the same time is on the kinds of trials that are being done. The robust phase 3 trials that have tens of thousands of people that look for clinically relevant endpoints and that document safety are still being done to the same gold standard that vaccine companies use to date. And you've seen many of the vaccine companies actually do very unprecedented things in terms of talking about their vaccine research, releasing their full clinical protocol, making a pledge to the safety in public. Like, really, companies have tried to be very overt and very transparent about their commitment to doing the research to the highest standards possible worldwide. Where we are also saving time is through the public-private partnership with the government. You'll see the brown line over the top of the second bar is actually the manufacturing of doses before approval. Normally, companies wait until they're completely finished with clinical trials and through the FDA process before they start really ramping up manufacturing. Because we're in a pandemic and there's a need, if these vaccines work, to get them available to people quickly, companies in partnership with the government are producing doses right now. If the government's failed the CDC test or the FDA test of actually working and don't get through approval, those doses will not be used. But this way, if they do work, we're ready to go, we have them, and we can start deploying. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of captures the distribution discussion that was actually just shared by the previous speakers. So we know that the products, of course, have to finish their clinical trials, work on this manufacturing, and then they must go through the FDA authorization process. That is, they will probably have an emergency use authorization that looks at some interim analysis, assesses the risks and benefits of those vaccines, and makes them available in this very unique regulatory designation of an emergency use authorization. These vaccines will continue to do their research and will absolutely go to full approval and licensure by the FDA. This is really something you use only in an emergency. The manufacturing will ramp up even more. The CDC will have its actually advisory committee process, and they will look at each vaccine. They will look at each vaccine versus the framework of the populations that need the vaccine, and they will match the two together and make a recommendation to states and providers and clinicians of how each vaccine should be matched to the target populations. In addition, I want to focus on one thing at the bottom. I wanted to make sure that the legislature understood that there are very robust safety systems in place in the United States, led in partnership between the CDC and the FDA. And part of the training that will happen when vaccines are approved is making sure that all immunizers understand how to report safety issues if they see them, where that data goes. The data will be continuously collected. And then there are extra systems on top of that to look at causality and make sure we are able to see any trends that show up or any surprising adverse events that we don't see in the clinical trials. So the United States actually has a very robust safety system for vaccines, and that is actually being expanded to make sure we're ready to cover the COVID vaccines when they arrive. Next slide. So I'll end here, actually. I have another slide, but I think it's important to show what Dr. Chen talked about. There will be a ramp up of doses as the new products get authorized and approved, and as they start to ship doses from the manufacturing sites and companies really ramp up manufacturing. So our hope is, obviously this will depend on FDA and CDC, that we'll start to see maybe one or two of the vaccines that actually get through the approval process in December or January. And then those products plus others will certainly come on board. And what we hope is to see a scale up to where every adult American could get 2 shots of some combination of any one of the vaccines. They can't be mixed together. So we will be in an allocation mode in the beginning, but very quickly we'll move hopefully to broad availability. And as the gentleman from UMMS said, that's when we'll start leveraging pharmacists and other sites where it'd be easy for people to get the vaccine. I'll also say the Pfizer vaccine actually has been, that's the one that's -70, has actually been studied with a shipper that actually keeps it cold, and that shipper has dry ice in it, but they have been thinking about how to help with the cold chain at the site of vaccination. So they've invested in a whole host of various packaging materials to help maintain the cold chain for the vaccine, as it is very unique. I think I have another slide, but I think that Dr. Chen actually covered this. This is the prioritization framework that's being discussed with the advisory committee for the CDC, and it looks very similar to the National Academy was one presented as well. They overlap and really focus on that combination of risk for disease risk for transmission and underlying risk of risk conditions. And so you go out from the dark circle of healthcare workers into those concentric circles, and very quickly you reached more than half of US adults being eligible in the allocation timeframe. I think, go ahead, next slide. Yeah, so I think companies will give you more detail on the products, but I wanted to give you that overarching landscape and drill down on some of the questions you posed. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Dr. Nettles?
President Ferguson, Speaker Jones, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I began my career as an infectious disease physician treating people living with HIV in Baltimore, so it's an honor to speak to you today. And as Phyllis just said, I think she's provided a very nice overview of the process, and I'd like to drill down now into what that means for a specific company working on vaccines, in this case, Johnson & Johnson and Janssen. Let's go to the next slide. So at J&J, we began our response, you can go to the next slide. We began our response to the COVID-19 pandemic in January. We quickly scaled up our ability to screen our late stage and marketed compounds, looking for antivirals to actually treat those who are infected with the coronavirus. And we're also currently exploring our immunomodulators to see if they have an effect, particularly in those who are most severely impacted with coronavirus, for instance, those patients who are hospitalized, to see if we can mitigate the impact of the disease on those people. But today, what I'm going to talk about is on the left of this slide, what we've been doing to develop a vaccine against coronavirus, leveraging our AdVac technology. Next slide. And so you can continue to click it and build out the slide. Several of the speakers this morning, including Dr. Chen and Phyllis Arthur, spoke to one way that we're able to move forward with the development of vaccines confidently and as quickly as possible is leveraging technology that has been used against other serious infectious diseases. And so this Ad26-based vaccine technology has been under development at J&J for years. We have used it for a licensed Ebola vaccine, which has now been approved in Europe. We've studied it in HIV. We have a phase 3 development program ongoing, and respiratory syncytial virus, which is RSV. We've completed a phase 2 program there. We've used this technology across the spectrum of ages, including elderly, in HIV-infected individuals, in pregnant women and women who are breastfeeding, and in children down to the age of 4 months. So with regard to the platform, not the specific coronavirus vaccine, but the Ad26 platform, we have a good deal of experience with it in over 110,000 individuals vaccinated. And it has been generally well tolerated and safe in those individuals. Next slide. We're also working with some of the world's best scientists and have had an attempt to be extremely transparent and collaborative in developing this vaccine to make sure that we get the most important input that we can. Importantly, we're doing this vaccine development in collaboration with BARDA and the US FDA, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and we're scaling up our ability to produce large quantities of the vaccine in parallel with conducting our pivotal registrational trials. You'll see that Emergent Biosolutions is listed there on the right-hand side of the slide. At the Bayview facility, we're actually producing some of our vaccine. So I thought that was important to mention in this setting. Next slide. Here's the timeline that we have been undergoing to develop a vaccine. As I said, we began in January with the release of the genetic sequence out of China. We have now conducted a phase 1/2A clinical trial that is available on a public server and will soon be published, hopefully in the New England Journal of Medicine. That allowed us to move forward with a phase 3 clinical trial called Ensemble. And I'd like to provide you some more details on that phase 3 trial on subsequent slides. We anticipate having results of our phase 3 trial by the end of the year. And in parallel with that, we've been working with the US government, and we have an agreement for an advanced purchase of 100 million doses of the vaccine. Next slide. In the early portion of our development program, we studied the vaccine in non-human primates and in hamsters. The results of those trials are shown on the left-hand side. They're published in Nature and Nature Medicine. The phase 1/2A clinical results showed that with a single dose of our vaccination, we see very nice production of antibodies and cellular immunity, and that response was shown across the age range, including healthy adults, but also in the elderly. The vaccine was generally well tolerated, and that allowed us to move forward with our phase 3 clinical trial. Let's go to the next slide there. So that phase 3 clinical trial is called Ensemble. It's currently enrolling individuals, so we're dosing individuals as we speak. And as Phyllis Arthur mentioned, it's important to understand that this phase 3 clinical trial is a very large clinical trial where we're enrolling between 30 and up to 60,000 individuals. The trial is enrolling in 6 countries in South America, in South Africa, and in many sites around the United States. So this is not a small clinical trial, and we have not cut corners with regard to the clinical development program in an effort to get this vaccine out quickly. Actually, this is on the larger end of clinical trials that you'll see to support the approval by the FDA of a vaccine. We're very committed to transparency. We've published the study protocol on the internet so that everyone can see exactly how the trial will be run. And we have a strong commitment to ensuring that we enroll the healthy adults, but also the elderly who are most severely impacted by this disease, and a commitment to enrolling a diverse population. We understand that the COVID pandemic has hit certain populations in the US, Black, Hispanic, Latinx, American Indian, Alaskan Natives, most severely. And so it's really critical that we enroll a representative population in our clinical trials. And the next slide speaks to that with regard to our commitment to that. We have seen that medicines and vaccines can have different safety and efficacy profiles in different races and ethnic groups. So that's really why it's really important to make sure that you've enrolled a diverse population in your clinical trials. It's the right thing to do, and we will show the efficacy and the safety by the different racial and ethnic groups that we include in our clinic, that we are able to enroll in our clinical trial. Next slide.
We have about 1 more minute, Dr. Nettles.
Thank you. We've also committed to making the vaccine available on a not-for-profit basis during the pandemic, and we've come to a number of agreements with governments around the world, including the US, as I mentioned, for 100 million doses, and the US government has the right to purchase an additional 200 million doses should they desire that. And I think the next slide is my last. I want to echo what some of the other presenters said, that any vaccine is not worth really anything if individuals are not willing to take it. And so at J&J and Janssen, we're committed to cutting no corners with the development of this vaccine. And in fact, our CEO has committed that we will not file this vaccine with the FDA until we feel that it has met a high standard for efficacy and safety. And we feel that it would be appropriate to use in individuals. Safety of individuals at J&J is our highest priority. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nettles. Next up, we have Ms. Bloomquist, the Corporate Affairs for Astrazeneca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, President Ferguson and Speaker Jones, for inviting AstraZeneca to present. I want to start by saying that AstraZeneca is very proud to call Maryland home to our largest footprint in North America. We have approximately 5,000 employees, including our Gaithersburg Research and Development site, as well as manufacturing in Frederick. And we continue to lead efforts and believe in the importance of growing the ecosystem in Maryland and establishing the Maryland region as a top-tier biohub destination by 2023. We have collaborations with Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and the NIH. We have responded to the pandemic consistent with our values to follow the science, to put patients first, and to do the right thing. And we've progressed on a number of initiatives, including efforts to make available a potential vaccine or treatment option for the virus. In late April, AstraZeneca and Oxford announced an agreement for global development and distribution of the vaccine that was under development by Oxford. And so if we go to the next slide, I'd like to talk a bit about that vaccine candidate. The candidate itself is made from the ChAdOx1 virus, which is a weakened version of a common cold virus that causes infections in chimpanzees. It's been genetically changed, so it cannot grow in humans. And genetic material has been added which is used to make the spike protein that's found in the coronavirus. The spike protein binds to receptors on human cells to enter the cells and which cause the infection that we think of as COVID-19. So after vaccination, the surface spike protein is produced and primes the immune system to attack the virus if it later infects the body. Our hope is to make the body recognize and develop an immune response to the spike protein to help it stop the coronavirus from entering human cells and preventing infection. And that's really what we're testing through the phase 3 clinical trials. If you go to the next slide. I also wanted to talk a bit about our long-acting antibody combination. And both of these, we've announced large-scale funding agreements with the US government and are testing both of these in phase 3 trials. Our long-acting antibody combination is really meant for individuals who may not be the best candidates for vaccination. And when we think about our COVID response, we know that it has to be multi-pronged. And so this may be a good solution for patients who are immunocompromised, who live in highly dense areas, or for potentially people who live in assisted living facilities. And it's actually 2 monoclonal antibodies. We worked with Vanderbilt University to identify those. We've seen some very promising preclinical data, and we've announced a phase 1 funding agreement with DARPA. And again, we're getting ready to start a phase 3 clinical trial, actually 2 of them in the United States, to look at these long-acting antibody combinations and how they can potentially be a solution for other parts of the population as we think about a holistic response to the coronavirus. If you go to the next slide. So I just wanted to touch briefly, we have 2 US government agreements, again, that I discussed. And this is part of a global picture where, similar to the comments of other presenters, we're thinking about the response that we need to make on a worldwide basis. And we've really thought about this in a region by region basis. So what is happening in the US is also happening in other sites in the world, both in terms of phase 3 clinical trials, but as well as manufacturing. You'll see on the left-hand side, when we talk about AZD 1222, that's our vaccine candidate. And so there we announced an early commitment with the US government and Operation Warp Speed that was valued at over $1 billion to support the development, production, and delivery of the vaccine. So that includes a large phase 3 trial of 30,000 trial participants, as well as the manufacture simultaneously of 300 million doses. That work is being done in part in Maryland, so we're really proud of that. And our hope is to advance both the clinical trial as well as manufacture of the doses in parallel. And hopefully, if the vaccine is proved safe and effective and has received the reviews from FDA and other government regulators, then we will be able to supply it to citizens to those in the United States, not just citizens, but more broadly. On the other side, we see just a quick highlight of AZD 7442, which is our long-acting antibody agreement. This one is more recent, and so it's funding of $486 million from DoD BARDA. Again, it's for funding of 2 phase 3 trials that will look at the use of these antibodies, as well as a commitment to produce 100,000 doses and an option for the government to purchase up to 1 million doses under a separate agreement. Under both of these agreements, the government will provide the doses at no cost. AstraZeneca has made a commitment with regard to the vaccine that we will provide the vaccine at no profit during the pandemic. And it's something that we're very proud of. And again, as we think about our worldwide program on vaccine development, as well as the potential role that antibodies may play, we feel this is a great source of pride for our employees, and also, I think for all associated with these projects, how we're potentially responding to the pandemic. So with that, I know you'd like to allow time for questions, so I will close and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Bloomquist, for that overview. Looks like we have one question from Senator Jim Roosevelt.
Thanks a lot, Mr. President. I wanted to ask all three industry representatives, are your agreements with the federal government, do they bar you from selling the approved vaccine in the private market?
I can go first. I do not believe that they do. However, having said that, the supply, at least for the initial time point, there would not be supply available to go through a parallel path in the commercial marketplace.
Same, under our commitment, we will first deliver the 300 million doses of the vaccine. And, I think that if there is a potential to work with a private market after, of course, we'll have those conversations. But the first priority is to supply the government with the doses that they've purchased.
So your legal commitment is to have to supply the first X number of doses to the federal government before you can sell in the private market. Is that correct?
So just in terms of manufacturing 300 million doses and the path that we're taking, yes, that is what will happen. We will supply the 300 million doses to the government. And then if there is potential conversations with the private market, that will happen then after.
Yeah, I think it's important to think of this in two phases. I think the first phase, everyone's operating under the pandemic time. And I think what happens with the COVID-19 vaccines when we pass through this pandemic time will really depend on how the CDC and the thought leaders and public health think about how the vaccine gets used in the longer term. So
with due respect, that's not my question.
I understand.
I'm talking about legal commitments that have been made by the companies to the federal government.
Right. Yeah, I think they've allocated all their doses to the federal procurement at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Majority Leader Lukey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you all for the presentation. And my question, I guess, is a little bit more long-term. I think one of the untold stories here that we're not that isn't being thoroughly covered and won't be until after we've addressed COVID is the use of really innovative technologies to roll out these vaccines. Monoclonal antibodies for treatment. There's a long-term question here, right? We will continue to face potential pandemics of disease. So my question for you is maybe more long-term. As a state, where should we be looking in order to support the continued development of those technologies and our readiness in Maryland as with our biotech sector to continue to innovate? I mean, is it best for us to be looking at funding basic research? Is it, supporting SBIR programming? Is it, what is it? Is it workforce, investing in biomanufacturing workforce? Where should we be looking over the long term?
I think I would respond, again, as having a large presence in the state of Maryland. I think it's a bit of all of the above. To have a robust ecosystem, you need all of those different parts working together, because NIH plays a really different role than we do as we think about what makes a strong ecosystem and as we build the biohub. And so it's having the right workforce, it's having companies that are committed to research and development. It's having that early research piece. I think you need all of that working. And, one of the pieces around the pandemic that, with so many horrible things that have happened, I think a place where we take real comfort is that we had a strong, pharmaceutical life science industry that was willing to step up and respond and had the capabilities to do that. And again, that doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen without a lot of careful planning and thinking about what goes into all the pieces for everybody to work together on it.
I'll add one thing. I think that what Maryland has that many states don't is companies of all different sizes, and that ecosystem is the kind of ecosystem we'd like to mirror across the United States. So I think the idea of things like J Labs that incubate novel technologies, for example, if you look at what was successful with the coronavirus vaccines, a lot of the early innovation was platforms sitting inside small companies, and then the ability to partner with large companies that know how to really do large clinical trials and do manufacturing scale up. That literally everything that makes the ecosystem stronger at both ends is good for not just our pandemic preparedness, but the arrival of new products overall. So, fostering an environment that allows novel technology to be financed, both the private side and public side, leads to lots of innovation through companies growing bigger like Novavax and Moderna, who were small 7 months ago, 10 months ago, and now are on the precipice of being global players. That's good for the bioeconomy. And that's also good for development of novel products long term.
Continued investment in manufacturing and supply chain capabilities here in the US, I think, is also critical so that they can be scaled up when we need them. And when there's a crisis like this, that we are comfortable that we have a secure supply chain.
I want to thank everyone, thank our panelists, and we're going to move on to our next segment. And we'll be dealing with the Maryland Department of Health. On October 16th, our Department of Health submitted our vaccine distribution plan to the federal government. We are joined by Secretary Neal and Deputy Secretary Chen, who will walk us through the plan. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Mr. President. Hope everybody is safe and well. Before I begin, I want to thank Dr. Markozzi and Dr. Chen for their tremendous contribution to our efforts. They were on the governor's advisory, and they've been working with us hand in glove throughout this, and I sincerely appreciate their efforts on our behalf. Our COVID-19 vaccination planning efforts have been underway with our federal partners since the spring. The plan that we submitted almost a couple of weeks ago is a draft and will evolve as more information becomes available. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will be the central distributor for vaccines. New information, and I say this with some humor, new information is coming from the federal government on a continual basis. You might say daily or maybe even hourly. Most of it is consistent, but we still have some issues. There are several vaccine products in development. I enjoyed seeing the horse race chart that the industry put up that shows all the various activities and where they are in the process. And so we'll have several likely candidates for the first vaccine out of the gate. We need more information from the federal government on distribution, cost sharing, and federally provided supplies. That's sketchy right now, and it's really one of my biggest worries, because if the federal government says they're going to provide something and then change their mind, we might have supply chain issues. So I've instructed everyone to try to assemble everything we need for vaccinations, notwithstanding what the current order of the day is, because this is a necessary part of the continuum. No vaccines have been approved by the FDA as yet, as you know. As vaccines receive emergency use authorization, they will be reviewed by a technical advisory group, which we stood up with Maryland experts that will assist us in the issues that arise with the various vaccines. Healthcare providers are currently registering with the state to administer COVID-19 vaccine. Local health departments, hospital systems, and pharmacies will also be key partners for vaccine administration. Planning for the vaccination response. The plan's based upon the CDC COVID-19 vaccination interim playbook, and I emphasize the word interim, for jurisdictional operations. Planning will evolve as the federal government releases information, including recommendations from the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices regarding priority groups. I will now turn it over to Dr. Chen, who will talk about the phased approach we're taking.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Mr. President and Madam Speaker and members of the COVID-19 work group. I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning to talk a little bit more about Maryland's plan, or at least our interim plan as we have envisioned it using CDC guidance to date. Our approach will be roughly in 2 phases, and I'll go into a little bit of detail on that in the next slide using a similar CDC graphic. We will be looking in our phase 1 with a limited availability of vaccine to vaccinate critical populations that will be aligned with the ACIP guidance once that becomes available for the specific vaccines that are approved by the FDA. And so right now we don't have good visibility on how much allocation or supply might be coming to our state, but that is an important and critical question that we have. Phase 2 will begin when we have some level of our phase 1 targets met, meaning that we have vaccinated a significant portion of that critical phase 1 high priority population. And phase 2 will also coincide with, as the prior panel indicated, when there is a much greater volume of available vaccine available for the public, and so a greater number of individuals will be able to receive vaccine. So next slide. So this, you've seen this graphic before, and so this is a CDC graphic where essentially they're looking at it in 3 different phases, which might span, years really if you look at their 3rd phase. So the first phase is, again, with that limited doses available, as I indicated, Maryland's phase 1. Our phase 2 will kick in, again, once we have some confidence that we have vaccinated a fair portion of the high priority populations and when a greater number of doses are available. And then we anticipate, as CDC indicates in their phase 3, sort of a routine strategy, and that may be a year or longer from now. So next slide. Some of our key plan components, and if you have our plan, which is available on the governor's website, we have a number of different elements of the plan that we have begun to implement and put in place, but I'm going to highlight some of the key components of them. So first, next slide, please. So first, with provider enrollment, that's really critical in that we need to have providers who are able to administer the COVID vaccine. And so we are going to be building upon our existing immunization information system called Immunet. And we have been enhancing our systems to be able to handle the added users, as well as the information that will be required to be collected specific for COVID-19 to convey that back to the CDC. This is a system that is already connected with the CDC, and so we are building on that, that infrastructure. In addition, we already have a number of providers registered within Immunet because as of last year, it is a requirement for all providers who provide any kind of immunizations to individuals in Maryland to actually enter that immunization information into Immunet. We will continue, however, to work through our various partners at the hospitals and long-term care facilities and others to encourage that providers enroll to make sure that we do have sufficient numbers of vaccination providers to reach all Marylanders once we do have that increased volume of vaccines available. Next slide, please. So when we talk about vaccine ordering and distribution, the registered providers within Immunet will be able to place their COVID vaccine orders in the Immunet system. And what we're looking to do is to have as many providers as we can pre-register in Immunet and become familiar with the system. Their order will come to us at the state level, and we will then push those orders over to CDC based on the amount of vaccine supply that we are provided or indicated that is available for the state. And then once that order goes through, that vaccine will be shipped directly to the provider from CDC's distributor. Our work will be to coordinate with the providers themselves to make sure that we stay on top of the inventory, as well as the numbers of vaccines that are administered and how many individuals and where those individuals are across the state, to make sure that that those individuals get, if 2 doses are required, that they get those 2 doses and from the same vaccine. And so those are going to be some of the detailed work that our team at MDH will be very critically involved in to make sure that providers not only get the vaccine, but for second doses, that they receive the same vaccine for the population that they serve. Next slide, please. In terms of vaccine administration, in the phase 1 approach, it will be as in the CDC graphic. It will initially be primarily in closed systems, and what that means is essentially we'll be working with, much like with the university system and other hospitals, with our local health departments and other sites, to make sure that we have specific vaccination sites for these high-risk populations. So closed means basically that the vaccines will be made available for the individuals who are in the highest risk groups, and that the vaccines will be made available for those. Those might include some of our healthcare workers, for example, and certainly individuals who are at the highest risk of developing complications from COVID-19 disease. Once we do have more vaccine available to the entire state, that's when some of our other key community providers, including FQHCs, primary care physicians, urgent cares, pharmacies, and others, will have much more access to vaccine, so that all Marylanders will be able to receive through their healthcare provider, similar to how they would receive a flu shot now. And ultimately, our goal is that any Marylander who wants to be vaccinated will be able to receive a vaccine. With all of this and, health equity, and this has been discussed earlier by, I think, Dr. Markozzi and others, that health equity and understanding that the impact of this disease and this pandemic on some of our underserved and minority populations is absolutely critical in our considerations as we look at how we allocate vaccine across the state. So, next slide, please. So to that end, I have here highlighted the phase 1 priority groups, and this is all subject to change and is really going to be ultimately based on what the final ACIP recommendations will be for the specific vaccines that are approved, and so may be very much or will be very much based on what the efficacy data show for different populations, for example, for the various vaccines that are being considered and are currently in phase 3 trials. But similarly to H1N1 in 2009, the vaccine that came out then was initially prioritized for individuals who were at highest risk of complications. So individuals with underlying healthcare conditions, healthcare workers, people who are really at the front line caring for patients. And that's really important because in many cases, we have to protect our healthcare workers as they might be the carriers of the infection to individuals and the patients that they're caring for. So those are some of our critical components. But ultimately, the vaccine prioritization as we sub-prioritize even, especially in the initial weeks or early months of the vaccine initiatives, that we will be looking to provide this important resource for the people who are at the highest risk. So next slide, please. So I want, I'm going to be closing by talking about communication and outreach. And, I will say that this is probably our most critical, the most critical work that we will be doing. And this is not to necessarily, minimize the amount of coordination, logistics, and other work that we also are in the middle of right now. But it is really critical that we share information and facts, and I am very appreciative of our pharmaceutical industry partners who have made their commitments to be transparent to the public and to the people that we all serve in sharing information and data about what they're seeing in vaccine trials, and I think that that will go a long way. However, we recognize that even historically that there are groups that may be more hesitant to accept a vaccination than others, that we will need to provide the facts as we have them about the vaccines to make sure that we answer the questions that people have and instill confidence in the work that our scientific partners, our federal partners, and our local partners are doing to make this available for Marylanders to protect us against COVID-19. Our outreach efforts, we absolutely recognize, will need to be culturally competent and reach minority populations and take into account those different populations throughout the state in terms of communication, in terms of education, and not just language appropriate, but culturally appropriate is really critical. Next slide, please. To that end, at least in part, we are pulling together two advisory groups. The Secretary mentioned one, which is our Vaccine Technical Advisory Group, who will be a group of subject matter experts who will help us take a look at the information and data as it's coming out and provide some of their perspective and thoughts as that information is available. But also equally important is a stakeholder advisory group. And pulling that together is important because we do want to make sure that we have important minority, faith-based community groups represented so that we can work with them to understand where the questions are and what the needs are of the communities that we serve so that we can meet those needs going forward to provide information, education in the most appropriate way possible. And so this is going to be the most critical work that we're doing in the weeks and months ahead. And so I wanted to close here by thanking all of our fellow panelists who preceded us from the university. They have been really integral, as the Secretary said, to Maryland's response, and we're very fortunate to have them at the table and, really rolling up their sleeves and implementing so many of the resources and activities that have been instrumental to Maryland's response. And also to our pharmaceutical partners who are critical as well. And I believe that we have local health who will be speaking next. And I will say that local health has really underpinned and been an important infrastructure for us as part of the response and will continue to be as we roll the vaccine plan forward. The last thing I would say is that please don't forget, as we're talking about COVID vaccine, flu vaccine is still very, very critical in this time. And so for individuals who are listening, for those here on the work group, if you have not received your flu vaccine, please go out and get it today. It is plentiful and you should be able to get it without a problem. It is really important to protect all of our health to make sure that flu vaccine is also top of our list. So I will close there and we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
First question is from Vice Chair Pena Milman.
Good morning. Good morning, Madam Speaker, and good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I have just a couple of questions I'm going to ask them, and if you will be so kind and write them down and give us the answers. So in New York, Governor Cuomo explicitly said that they won't distribute a vaccine to hospitals and local health departments if they're experts unconfident that it is safe to do so. Will you make the same promise in Maryland? And I know several states have said that already. And this is because of the speed at which this is being produced at the federal level. And, sort of people feel that it's just not safe because it's being produced so quickly. And we learned that today as well. So that's one question. And then the other question I have, are you going to have a post-vaccination monitoring program? Again, New York is having a vaccine adverse event reporting system that they're creating so that people can call in when they have an adverse reaction. And they have actually ordered the insurance companies and Medicaid to report as well to this system. Is Maryland creating such a system? And the last question I have is regarding the communities of color. As you know, out of the 24 jurisdictions in Prince George's, in Maryland, Prince George's County has the highest number of COVID cases with over 30,000. And the zip code with the largest number is 20783 with over 3,000, where the immigrant Latino community lives. So it's clear that the Black and Brown communities are being affected. In your phases, phase 1 and 2, where is the priority given to this group? How can you assure us? Because they should be priority because they're being affected greatly. Thank you for the consideration, and I'm looking forward to your answers.
Thank you so much, Delegate Pena-Melnick. And so, for us, safety and efficacy of the vaccine is of highest priority, and that's really first and foremost. And I think we are very pleased to hear some of the information and transparency coming from the pharmaceutical industry to better understand the data. And that's the reason why we stood up our technical advisory group, and we are in process of doing that right now. The information that comes through about each and every vaccine has to be about safety and efficacy first and foremost, and that's what our key focus is. And if there are concerns or doubt, we certainly want to be sure to understand what the reasons for those are, and want to be sure that any vaccine that we push out meets that very high bar. So in terms of your other questions, we will be working with, and all the states are working with the CDC in terms of making sure to monitor adverse events after a vaccine is distributed and or administered to individuals. And so there are a number of different systems in place, certainly at the federal level, and I believe that we will be working to make sure that any adverse event reporting is tied into the federal system. The pharmaceutical industry may also be able to speak to some of that because we recognize that the work and the information that, from the phase 3 trials are very, very critical, but so is post-approval monitoring. And so that is something that certainly will be done in partnership with our pharmaceutical partners. And then lastly, as we look at the areas of highest risk, that is certainly a consideration when we look at populations that have been affected, and when we look in our initial phases with limited vaccine availability, information about impact of where the pandemic is at any given point in time, geographically and with minority populations, and in concert with the priority groups that ACIP will be recommending. All of that will be taken into account as we allocate this very limited resource, certainly in the beginning and then throughout. And what we are hearing certainly is that the numbers of vaccine will increase quickly, but we will certainly be looking with a health equity and disparity lens as we look at allocating of vaccines across the state.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. And members, we have about 9 minutes, so Just a reminder is we have a number of questions, if we could keep them targeted. First, we have Chairman Paul Pinsky of Education, Health, Environmental Affairs.
Thank you, Senate President and Madam Speaker. Dr. Chen, on one of your slides a little while ago on phase 1, you had a number of categories: first responders, older adults in congregated living. You can see they all make perfect sense to me. I saw judiciary, and while I saw judiciary, I didn't see anything about education workers. Education workers may actually be required to return to work, and you also know that Governor Hogan has made returning to in-person instruction a high priority. So I'd like to know where education workers, teachers, support staff, et cetera, who are going to be in fairly tight situations, where they fit into phase 1, or if they're not in phase 1, why not?
So certainly when we looked at phase 1, all of this is subject to change. So I will put that out there. And phase 2 is where many of the essential workers are. That would include education. That's where they currently are. And this is in looking at the National Academy of Sciences recommendations and others. Our highest priority will be people who are at highest risk, and so individuals who are in contact with or may pose a risk to individuals in congregate care settings is where we believe those are the individuals who would be highest priority. But as we've indicated, and as CDC has indicated, that the initial vaccine supplies will be limited. So even among the highest priority populations within congregate care settings and others, there will be some limited vaccine and a need to allocate among them. So.
Okay. Speaker Pro Tem Sample Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and Senate President, and to all those assembled today. This has been very good information. My questions for Secretary Neal or for Dr. Chen. As it stands today for Maryland, have you done an assessment or planning to do an assessment of which areas may not be prepared to accept the vaccine, given what we know with regards to the storage capacity? What I don't want to see happen is that, we get the vaccine, but then we turn around maybe later to say, well, this segment of the population or this particular region is not equipped to handle storage, et cetera, those types of challenges that may arise. So has that assessment been done already, given the current information that you're aware of? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Those are exactly the kinds of things that we continue to work on. So yes, an initial assessment has been done, and we are putting in orders for supplies and other things to make sure that we have the ability to provide vaccine storage and such. But this also is predicated to a certain extent on the type of vaccine that will be available. And so some of them, as you have heard, will require that ultra cold storage that has much more special handling than other vaccines that we currently have that are used around the state already. And so we're trying to make those decisions on where we can deploy some of those resources so that across the state, people are prepared to be able to administer vaccine. In addition, some of those vaccines that require ultra cold temperature, as was alluded to earlier, the pharmaceutical manufacturers themselves are thinking through the problems with us so that in the shipping containers we may be able to store, and we're anticipating being able to store the vaccine for a certain period of time at that very low temperature so that they remain viable regardless of where they go. But I think to your point, there is still a lot unknown, and there's been indication that if a vaccine comes to us in a very large quantity, say it's 1,000 or 2,000 in a certain pallet or in a package, those may only be able to be allocated to certain kinds of facilities or organizations. And in that, we are very much working with our local health departments across the state to ensure that capacity is available.
Vice Chairman of Budget and Tax, Senator Roosevelt.
There we are. Thank you very, very much. This is for the Secretary, kind of two related questions. One is, Mr. Secretary, are you assuming that at least in phase 1, the only source of vaccine for Maryland will be from the federal government, or are you contemplating a plan B where the state has to go out and procure it on its own? That's question number 1.
I think we're, I have an aversion to assuming anything, but I think the major stream is going to be from the federal government because they purchased hundreds of millions of doses, and I think the pharmaceutical firms are obligated to fill those orders first, and I would certainly want to get our fair share of those of that allocation. So I'm not aware of any other opportunities that are opening up, but I'll keep my ears open.
Okay, second question is, are you going to prohibit hospital systems, doctors' offices, people from buying the vaccine on their own?
I really haven't contemplated that decision. The vast majority of these vaccines are going to be distributed at no cost, and I don't know why a physician would buy vaccine from a vendor when there could be an adequate allocation at no charge.
Well, because of the shortage to begin, there's going to be a big shortage to begin with. Everybody says that, so I would think there'd be a significant minority of people and institutions who would want to get to the head of the line. I just throw that out there to think about.
I understand, but to be honest, I haven't thought about it. We've spent most of our time trying to figure out how this thing is going to work from the pharmaceutical companies to the CDC and to us.
Thank you.
Making that work.
Appropriations, Vice Chair Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you all for the presentation. Quick question. So when we look at the priority groups, these workers and these folks that are in the priority groups have to go home. So when we talk about the dosages being available for those who are requesting them, so would there be a prioritization for first responders, family members, should they choose to receive the doses?
Thank you for that question. Again, we are going to rely very much on the CDC's ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, for guidance on that. So that is a helpful question and for us to consider, and we have had those discussions. And so again, I think it is early yet until we get the final ACIP recommendations to be able to put that forward. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
We have 2 final questions. We have Senator Clarence Lamb.
Thank you, President Ferguson. I've been reading the state's COVID vaccine plan because we've had to interface with it over at Hopkins in my other role. And I just had 2 quick questions about the plan. One, which I asked earlier to the earlier panel about the procurement of ultra cold freezers. The current plan does not recommend that there be procurement of ultra cold freezers. I want to get your sense and understanding of why that is and what your plans are for that. And number 2, the plan also says that the COVID vaccine and ancillary supplies will be procured and distributed by the federal government at no cost. And wanted to see what the contingency planning is in place from the state level if the federal government is not able to procure essential supplies, as we've kind of seen over the last 6 or 7 months, things like PPEs that might be an increase in need for, items like syringes and those types of items where they're already becoming short, as you're probably aware, because of the likelihood that a vaccine would come forward. So if you could answer those 2 questions, that'd be great. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Senator Lamb, for that. So while in the playbook, if you read the CDC playbook, they did not recommend that states purchase their own freezer capacity and such. However, in our state and with under the direction of the Secretary, we are looking to purchase some capacity for storage. In addition, as I alluded to earlier, we did a scan of resources across the state and are looking to partner with some of our, primarily in research universities who may have some of that ultra-cold storage capacity. So that's one. On the supply side, again, I think that given the experience that we all had in the early part of the pandemic, we will be moving forward with purchase of some of the ancillary supplies that include syringes and sharps containers and alcohol wipes and such, so that we are prepared as possible once vaccine arrives for our population.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Chair of our Finance Committee, Senator Kelly.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the idea of the list of entities that will be considered essential to get it first. This morning's news in the Baltimore region has indicated that certain communities in Baltimore City can't get trash collection for several weeks coming now. They'll have recycling, which suggests off community, not trash collection, because the trash collectors are in short supply now because of COVID. So that would create a really bad situation. The certain communities would have garbage piling up, the trash collectors not considered as essential workers, and so on. Those who are correctional officers serving jails, and especially juvenile justice, ought to be in that lineup to get it first. And people who are required to use mass transit to get to work or to school, which would include most of the secondary school kids in public schools in Baltimore City. Now, these school kids have really not been educated this year. And given that the pandemic is still with us, they're going to lose another year of real education. That is tragic. And so the teachers in the public schools and the other personnel that will serve them in some of these systems, since we don't have a statewide plan or dealing with various metrics as to when to return, it ought to include including that segment of the population in the upfront group to be served first. I hope you are considering essential workers of all kinds and not just those that have formally been included in the operational definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kelly, for that perspective. And you're absolutely right. You know, all of those essential workers that keep our lives going and our neighborhoods and schools and others are really critically important. But when we are looking at, and these are very, very difficult decisions to make, you know, in the early part of phase one, and I would reiterate that there will still be limited vaccine, even for the individuals and groups that are part of phase one priorities. And our highest priority will be for individuals who, because of underlying conditions or because of the setting in which they may be residing, such as nursing homes and long-term care facilities, that, you know, we know that half of our deaths came from those kinds of settings. And so that's where our highest priority will be. Now, in terms of occupational categories, those are many of the essential workers in terms of occupation are in phase two. However, for individuals who work in any of those settings who have underlying conditions that put them at higher risk of disease are included as part of phase one as well. So,
but also if they are vectors, because they are going back and forth between populations, even school kids, when they go back, if they have grandparents living in the same household, the kid becomes the vector. We need to look more generally at the configurations that we have in Maryland and at those who have to use mass transit. There's no way to really have proper distancing, and you're going back and forth in ways that are necessary for many essential workers and for school kids to be served.
Thank you. And I think that you raise an important point that we will, these are all very, very important questions and considerations. And I would add that, and this is important as well when we look at vaccine, is that even once we have the vaccine in the state and that we are being able to administer it widely, that it does not necessarily preclude the continued use of masking and physical distancing and other very, very important measures that we have in place now that I believe very strongly are already protecting Marylanders. So thank you for that consideration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Before we go to our very last one, just a very brief, we sort of saw it with PPE, and this has been a very hard experience for everyone. Where does the buck stop for vaccine distribution? Is it local distribution? Is it the partners? Is it the State Department of Health, the state level? Is it the federal government? Where as you look forward, where does the buck stop for Maryland's vaccine distribution plan?
Mr. President, I'll take that one. I think the buck stops with the Maryland Department of Health. It's our plan. We're responsible for carrying it out. And I think we'll be at least the major focal point on, we'll have partners and we'll have people who work with us. But if you're looking for a one-stop shop, I think it's the Maryland Department of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much. And we look forward to partnering with you to make sure this is as successful as possible. We appreciate your all's time and effort here. Our final section today is the local perspective. We are very pleased to have Dr. Leticia DeRosa, who is the Commissioner of Health for the Baltimore City Health Department, who has been with us for the last 90 minutes. So thank you for your time, and are very interested to hear how the local health department perspective for how the vaccine distribution will proceed.
Great. Thanks, President Ferguson and Speaker Jones, for this opportunity to talk about some of the work being done here at the local level. We do have a local mass vaccination task force, which includes local government agencies such as our Office of Emergency Management and our city's safety czar, and they're responsible for reviewing, analyzing, and developing plans for vaccine distribution, largely based on lessons learned from H1N1. So they're in the process of developing a plan, working closely with our state partners and federal partners as well. We do support and participate in the Maryland Department of Health COVID-19 vaccine work group. And I'll kind of just briefly harp on this because we don't have much time, but messaging, especially to minority community and our special populations, will be crucial. We know that they're looking at trusted ambassadors. We know that there is medical mistrust and concerns about the efficacy and safety of this vaccine. So we really need to work very closely with our federally qualified health centers, as well as trusted minority leaders in the community, to make sure that the messaging on the importance of this vaccine is heard. With that, I'll take questions since we don't have a lot of time.
Thank you, Dr. DeRosa. Are there any questions? If not, I'll ask you just one brief one. From your perspective as a local director, do you agree with that the Department of Health will largely be the entity responsible for the effective and successful distribution of the vaccine, and it'll be locals responding to directions from the state?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been successful, at least here in the city, is some of the partnerships we've formed at the local level. So speaking about our Latinx population in particular, which is only about 5% of our population, but made up about 15% of all of our COVID cases where we know ethnicity data, we've worked closely with local community-based organizations that are trusted in the community, and they've helped to be that messenger, and they've helped with testing, for instance. So we started off our mobile testing in the Latinx community and have subsequently been able to partner with multiple others in that community to provide testing. So as well as, again, working with the state, but I think that we'll have to be on the ground working with those local partners who are already trusted in the community to help with distribution. We also have a flu vaccine task force, which consists of multiple healthcare partners, schools of nursing and pharmacy, as well as local universities and academic partners to help with flu vaccine dissemination. And we're taking lessons learned and best practices from that group, and we'll bring it to our COVID vaccine planning group as well for distribution.
Excellent. Senate President Pro Tem Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Speaker, and colleagues. I just have a quick question. And thank you, Madam Health Officer. I was just wondering if we had given any thought to using community health workers or the sort of systems that have been put in place around contact tracing to reach those hard to reach groups once the message is developed around vaccinations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have been grant funded to start a program called the Baltimore Health Corps, which implores community health workers to begin with public outreach and education. And so we're already utilizing them around contact tracing and testing, and agree that we would like to use them in a similar fashion for COVID vaccine.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any further questions, Dr. Duraza. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for bearing with us, and we will continue to certainly be in touch as this progresses, and are very thankful for your great work thus far.
Thank you, guys.
Madam Speaker.
Yep. I just want to thank everyone for their patience and insights today. This was a long but very important briefing. The vaccine discussion will continue to play out over the coming weeks and months. The state will play a critical role in the delivery of a vaccine when and if we get one. As far as the next meeting, that is to be determined. We will continue to monitor the surge we're seeing in surrounding states and will plan appropriately. We need to stay engaged and continue to provide our constituents with the facts so they can make the best decisions for themselves and their families. Again, thank you for your participation in this long session today, and you and your families stay safe. Mr. President?
Short and sweet. Stay safe, wear your mask, go vote. See you all soon.